The alarm blared at 0317 station time, and Commander Lyra Osi was already awake. She had learned over 19 years of deep vacuum salvage operations that the body develops its own intuition for danger. It wasn't mysticism, it was standard. It was the accumulated sum of 1,000 voyages, where the wrong silence preceded disaster. So, when the ESV Perseverance's mass sensor pulsed with a reading that shouldn't exist in that empty sector, she was already on her feet, service jacket zipped to her neck, walking through the narrow corridors of the vessel before the second alarm completed its cycle. The Perseverance's operations room was small, functional, and slightly chaotic, just the way Lyra preferred it. Overlapping screens displayed real-time sensor feeds, and the shift operator, young technician Darius Cole, stared at the main reading with an expression that combined fascination and panic in equal measure. "Commander," he said without turning his head, "either our mass sensors fried in a very specific way or there's something enormous out there." Lyra positioned herself beside him and studied the data for 30 seconds without speaking. The object was 2 astronomical units away on a slightly inclined axis relative to the system's ecliptic plane. Estimated mass, 4 billion metric tons, length, approximately 3 kilometers, surface temperature consistent with prolonged vacuum exposure. "It's not an asteroid," she said finally. "No, Commander. The reflection spectrum is wrong. Asteroids reflect. This object is absorbing light across almost all frequencies. Albedo coefficient near 0. Lyra reached for the internal comms and pressed the general channel. "Chief Engineer Petrov, I need you on the bridge in 10 minutes. Dr. Vasquez, too. Bring the field analysis kits." Mikhail Petrov's reply was accompanied by the sound of tools clattering in the background. "Already dressed. Engine trouble?" "No. Much more interesting trouble." She cut the comm and looked back at the screen. 3 kilometers, inert, absorbing light. "Cole, any active radioactivity signals? Plasma? Residual magnetic fields?" "Negative for radioactivity above safety threshold. But there's a faint electromagnetic signal. Modulated, it seems, structured." Lyra crossed her arms. A structured signal meant intentional transmission. Intentional transmission meant something had been built, and 3 kilometers of near-zero albedo material, floating inert in a peripheral system with no record of presence, meant that something had been built by someone she had never encountered before. Mikhail arrived on the bridge with his hair still disheveled and his augmented reality glasses hanging around his neck. Behind him, Dr. Camila Vasquez carried 2 analysis kits and a scientist's expression that had just heard the word impossible in a context that made it possible. They were the 2 best specialists on the Perseverance, and Lyra had learned to read them both like precision instruments. Mikhail read the data in silence for 45 seconds. Then he took off his glasses, cleaned the lenses in a completely unnecessary reflex, and put them back on. "That's a ship," he said. "Yes," Lyra agreed. "A very large ship." "Yes. From no one I know." "Correct." He nodded slowly with the expression of someone performing cost-benefit calculations on an internal spreadsheet. "Are we approaching?" "I'm already calculating the interception course," Cole said without needing to be instructed. Dr. Vasquez had connected her analysis kits to the ship's sensor network and was compiling a more detailed electromagnetic spectrum. The signal Cole detected: "It's a looped transmission, multiple frequencies, multiple languages." She paused. "I recognize 3 of the languages. They are convergence tongues." The word dropped into the operations room air like a stone in a still pond. The Convergence. The sector's oldest interplanetary coalition, composed of 6 species with a history of technological development dating back to eras when humanity was still learning to cultivate wheat. Distant allies, formally. Trading partners with caveats. Occasionally paternalistic in a way Lyra found both understandable and profoundly irritating. "What does the transmission say?" Mikhail asked. Vasquez adjusted the translation parameters and let the system process for a moment. When the answer came, she read it aloud with the clinical neutrality of someone quoting a technical report. "Contaminated. Condemned. Do not approach. This vessel represents a level 7 hazard to all organic life forms. Withdraw immediately and notify the nearest convergence authority for containment and disposal procedures. This message repeats on an automatic cycle. Contaminated. Condemned." The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. "Level 7 hazard," Cole repeated in a slightly higher pitch than usual. "Scale of 1 to 10, Vasquez said. 7 is severe risk. Immediate evacuation recommended. 10 is planetary scale extinction risk. So 7 is manageable," Lyra said, and began walking towards the commander's chair. "Commander." Vasquez's voice had a different quality now, not alarm, but calibrated attention. "The Convergence abandoned a 3-kilometer ship. They don't do that for economy. If they decided it's easier to leave a structure of that size adrift than to recover it, there must be a very specific reason." "I agree completely," Lyra said, as she adjusted the navigation controls for the interception course. "And I intend to find out what it is." Mikhail had leaned against the wall and was looking at the data spectrum with narrowed eyes. That specific way of processing information Lyra knew well. When he spoke, it was to the screen, not to her. If the engines still have any residual power in the cores, the propulsion geometry I'm seeing here, that's nothing I've ever seen before. The Convergence uses gravitational field rings. This is different, more compact, more aggressive. Full analysis when we're at a safe scanning distance, Lyra said. "Defining safe as," Cole asked. "Close enough to read the data. Far enough to run if we need to." She looked at him. "Set emergency thrusters for one-touch activation, and I want the external force field at maximum level as we approach." At 04:42, the Perseverance was 200 kilometers from the object. At 05:15, they were 50. At 05:58, when the system's light reached the strange ship's hull at an angle sufficient to reveal its silhouette, the operations room fell silent for a completely different reason than before. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to the involuntary reverence humans feel when confronted with pure scale. The Convergence ship, or what was left of it, stretched across the external camera's field of view like a cathedral built by a civilization that had not experienced humility. The hull was made of a metal that absorbed light unevenly, creating shadow patterns that suggested impossible depth. Entire sections had been torn away by a force that had left fused and twisted edges in a way Mikhail, in a low voice, described as thermally inconsistent with any conventional weapon he knew. The lacerations in the hull were not cuts. They were absences, as if parts of the ship had simply ceased to exist in the space they once occupied. "Mikhail," Lyra said, and there was a different quality in her voice now. Not uncertainty, something closer to crystallized determination. "Can you stabilize the life support systems for an exploration team?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Give me 4 hours and I can build a primary access scaffold. I'll need Engineer Torres and Technician Park. You have 3 hours. Then I'll need coffee." "Cole, send coffee to the workshop." Lyra turned to the observation window, where the dead ship floated in absolute silence. "Vasquez, I want a full decontamination protocol prepared before any entry, no exceptions, and I want an open channel with the Unified Space Authority. We're going to need lawyers." "Lawyers?" Cole raised an eyebrow. Lyra allowed herself a half-smile. "Deep vacuum salvage rights. If the Convergence abandoned this ship, it's ours the moment we step inside it, and I want that documented before anyone calls us asking for it back." Cole blinked. "You're planning to take an alien warship. I'm planning to exercise the legal right of recovery over an abandoned object in an unclaimed international system." She turned away from the window, which happens to be an alien warship. At 09:03, the primary access scaffold was installed. At 09:17, Lyra Ose was the first human to cross the airlock of a convergence vessel, with an active personal containment field, a molecular analysis scanner on her left wrist, and the complete and unshakable conviction that there were things more frightening than the unknown. Chief among them was letting an opportunity like this pass by. The ship's interior was cold, dark, and enormous. The corridors were designed for beings almost 3 meters tall, and Lyra walked through their center like a child crossing an ancient temple. The walls displayed dark control panels, marked with angular writing that the Universal Translator partially identified as convergence operational syntax, but which showed archaic variations, perhaps a technical dialect of a specific species within the coalition. Camila Vasquez, right behind her, scanned everything in silence. Behind Vasquez, Mikhail Petrov stopped at the first machinery room he found and stood still for a time. Lyra didn't measure, looking at propulsion structures he had never seen before, with the specific expression of an engineer who had just found the answer to a question he didn't yet know he had. "Lyra," he said, in a tone so controlled it sounded like active containment. "You need to see this." She approached. In the propulsion cores, partially damaged but not destroyed, something still pulsed. A slow, deep rhythm, like a heart that hadn't received the message that the body had died. "The cores still have residual charge," Mikhail said, "and the field geometry I'm reading here. If the safety limiters were removed and the output parameters recalibrated." "What are you saying?" He looked at her with that specific expression that appeared whenever physics allowed something common sense forbade. "I'm saying this ship isn't dead. It's waiting." The beacon signal continued to loop in the empty space around them, repeating its warning to no one. Contaminated, condemned, do not approach. Lyra looked at the pulsing cores and felt something that wasn't exactly ambition, nor exactly responsibility, but a combination of both that had defined every important decision of her career. "Let's see what it needs," she said. And so began what historical records would later describe as the most audacious engineering project humanity had ever executed. In an abandoned hulk, in a forgotten system, against all reasonable advice, and with the greatest of irrational convictions, that broken things deserve a second chance. Mikhail Petrov had slept 4 hours in the last 3 days, and it was visible. Not in the quality of his work. That remained as precise as ever, perhaps more so, because there was a specific quality of focus that emerged in him when he was operating near the limits of reason. It was visible in the small peripheral details. The coffee mug he now carried as a permanent accessory, the hair he had given up combing after the second day, the notes covering every available surface of the Perseverance's analysis room in 3 different languages, including fragments of the convergence writing system he had begun to decipher on his own. Dr. Vasquez had documented this behavior with the clinical precision she applied to everything. "Cognitive immersion syndrome," she noted in the medical log. "Contraindicated for forced extraction. Recommendation: maintain stable caffeine supply and leave him alone." Lyra had agreed with the assessment. The discovery that had kept Mikhail awake was contained in 47 cubic meters of alien machinery located in the central propulsion sector of the convergence ship. The energy cores, which he had initially described as having residual charge, turned out to be considerably more than that. After 2 days of analysis with the most sensitive instruments the Perseverance possessed, he had built a model of the propulsion system that kept him awake not out of anxiety, but out of pure technical impossibility of stopping thinking. "Look here," he said. When Lyra appeared in the analysis room with 2 mugs and the level of patience she had cultivated specifically for when Mikhail entered what the crew called tunnel mode. He pointed to a holographic representation, slowly rotating in the center of the room. The convergence uses classic gravitational field rings. Energy goes in, field forms, ship moves, elegant, reliable, with integrated safety limiters that ensure the field never exceeds 67% of the system's maximum capacity. Why 67%? Lyra asked, because that was always the right question with Mikhail. Because at 68%, resonance harmonics begin to interact with the hull structure in a way that convergence engineers consider unacceptable. Structural vibration, potential material fatigue, risk of catastrophic failure. So they put a ceiling, 67%, safe, predictable, reliable. He paused and looked at her with that expression. Do you know what happens if you remove the limiters and recalibrate the output parameters with the correct field geometry? Mikhail, 94%. This ship can operate at 94% of the core's theoretical capacity. Speeds that convergence technical documents list as physically impossible. He touched the hologram, and the representation expanded to show the force paths within the system. The problem isn't the hull structure, which would hold. The problem is that the limiters weren't designed to be removed. They're hardwired, integrated into the control firmware at a level the convergence considered deep enough to be permanent. But they were designed by engineers who never worked with human control systems. He smiled, and there was something slightly wild about it. Our control systems were developed from decades of cost restrictions, impossible deadlines, and the constant need to make incompatible hardware talk to software that wasn't designed for it. We are, collectively speaking, the greatest experts in systemic jury-rigging in the documented galaxy. Lyra was quiet for a moment. Then, can you make it work? I already did, in simulation. He clinked his mug against hers in a toast. I need 2 weeks and a forge station we don't have. About that, Lyra said, I have a call from the Unified Space Authority in 20 minutes. The call, when it came, was accompanied by 3 lawyers, 2 bureaucrats, a convergence relations specialist named Dr. Nora Ellison, and a collective expression of institutional concern that Lyra had learned to recognize as the face organizations make when they are about to not help in any concrete way, but also not formally oppose. Commander Osei began the most senior of the bureaucrats, a man named Director Ashworth, with a voice trained to convey authority without an equivalent amount of substance. We have received your discovery report. First and foremost, we need to discuss the diplomatic implications. Deep vacuum salvage rights, Lyra said. Article 7, Paragraph 3 of the Interstellar Navigation Treaty of 21A7. Abandoned object in an unclaimed system, no surviving crew detected, with an active decommissioning signal emitted by the original owners. The ship is legally ours. One of the lawyers, a young woman with the accent of someone who had grown up on an orbital station, opened her mouth and then closed it. The convergence will dispute that interpretation, Ashworth said. Let them dispute it. The law is clear. Commander, the convergence represents 6 species with significantly superior technology to ours in multiple domains. Provoking them over a ship they consider military residue could have diplomatic consequences far exceeding the value of the find. Lyra looked at him for a moment. With all due respect, Director, if I had used the logic of avoiding diplomatic consequences as a criterion for salvage, I would have left behind an estimated 4 billion credits worth of technology and material in the last 19 years. We need the USA's support to fund the recovery and transport operations. There was a long pause. Dr. Ellison, who had been silent until then, spoke for the first time. What kind of operations? We need a forge station. Enough capacity to work with a 3-kilometer structure. And engineering teams specialized in alien propulsion systems. That doesn't exist. Then we'll need to build it. Lyra adjusted the camera angle so Mikhail's analysis data appeared in the background of the call. Dr. Ellison, with all due respect to your diplomatic concerns, This ship contains propulsion technology that puts our current capabilities 50 years away at minimum. The Convergence abandoned it because the cost of recovery exceeded, in their assessment, the value of what remained. That means, for us, the cost of recovery needs to be less than it would be for them. How? Because we have something they don't. She paused, calculating the effect. Engineers who make incompatible technology work for a living. The negotiation took 6 days. In the end, the USA approved funding for a temporary forge station in the system's asteroid belt, on the condition that all collected technical data be shared with the authority's research consortium. Lyra accepted. The part she didn't mention was that the research consortium would take years to analyze the data that Mikhail's team was already applying in real time. While negotiations occurred, the ship's exploration continued. It was technician Elena Park who found the spine. She was cataloging the armaments section, a task that had been assigned to her precisely because she had spent 2 years in armaments research facilities before joining the salvage team, when her scanner's sensors identified an anomaly in the aft section of the second weapon deck. What appeared, at a distance, to be a projectile embedded in the hull proved considerably stranger when she approached. The object was approximately 8 meters long and made of a material her scanner identified with a confidence level of only 34%, which Elena had learned to interpret as, "The instrument is working correctly, but the material has no precedent in the database." It was partially fused to the ship's hull, but interface analysis showed that the fusion was incomplete and that there had been, at some point in the process, an attempt at systemic integration that had been interrupted. In other words, the projectile had tried to connect to the ship, and the ship had tried to accept the connection, and both had stopped midway. Elena Park was the type of specialist who didn't speculate aloud about what she found. She cataloged, documented, analyzed, and then presented. When she entered the analysis room and placed the report in front of Mikhail and Lyra with the expression of someone who had found an artifact that redefines an entire category, both knew it was serious before reading a line. "It's a weapon," Elena said, "but not like any weapon I've ever seen. The material's molecular structure suggests it doesn't work by expelling projectiles or generating destructive energy in a conventional way. It operates at the atomic scale. It destabilizes the molecular cohesion of inorganic structures. Technically, what it does is make materials. Forget how to be solid." The silence that followed was the productive kind. "It was fired at the Convergence ship," Lyra said. "Yes, and it got stuck because the penetration geometry was miscalculated, or because the ship activated containment fields strong enough to prevent full penetration. Whatever fired this, it's not from the Convergence. The technological signature is completely different." "The Nulorn," Mikhail said in a low voice. Elena nodded. "That's my hypothesis, too. The Nulorn were why no one voluntarily patrolled the sector's edge. A force, intelligence, or phenomenon, Convergence records never reached a terminological consensus that had emerged on the fringes of mapped space approximately 200 years ago and had consumed, without negotiation and without a detectable pattern of strategic logic, 46 colonial systems. They did not communicate, they did not negotiate, they did not capture. They removed and moved on. They used a molecular destabilization weapon," Lyra said, processing. "And it got stuck here. And the ship tried to integrate it," Elena said. "The process was interrupted but not canceled. The integration data is still in the ship's firmware. With the right tools, we could complete the integration," Mikhail finished. He looked at Lyra. "We could use their weapon." Lyra stood before the observation window, where the ship's hulk was visible in the vacuum. 3 kilometers of dark metal and technology that the Convergence had decided wasn't worth the effort to save. An experimental weapon from a force that had destroyed 46 systems without making a single demand. And a team of humans with 4 hours of sleep, industrial quantities of coffee, and the deep conviction that broken things were waiting to be fixed. "How long to move the ship to the forge station?" she asked. "With the auxiliary thrusters that still work, plus the Perseverance's boosters as a tow," Mikhail calculated in real time, 8 days. 6, Lyra said. "Elena, I want a full analysis of the spine before we reach the station. Mikhail, start calculating the core recalibration parameters. We'll need everything ready for when the USA engineers arrive." "What do I tell them when they arrive and see what we're working on?" Mikhail asked. Lyra looked at him. "Tell them we found something broken and we're going to fix it. That's always the true answer." The towing began 6 hours later, and the convergence ship, still transmitting its looped warning into the empty vacuum, began its journey to the place where it would be made new. None of them slept much during the 6-day journey. There was too much work and too little time. And the most important things rarely wait for you to be rested to demand them of you. This, Lyra had learned over 19 years, was both the curse and the privilege of being human. The station was built in 92 days. This was impossible. The official records of the Unified Space Authority, drafted with the careful institutional language that exists to provide bureaucratic cover for what had already been done, stated built in record time thanks to exceptional resource mobilization. What the records did not say, because records never say the things that truly matter, was this. It was built by 2,300 people working 12-hour shifts in an asteroid belt with radiation above recommended levels, temperatures that swung between extremes requiring specialized suit glove heaters, and a deadline that had been set not by feasibility calculation, but by Commander Osei's simple insistence that there was a window of opportunity that would not wait for anyone's calendar. The chief engineer of the construction consortium, a man named David Santos, who had built 3 orbital stations and had believed before this one that he had seen everything space engineering could offer him, described the experience in a later interview with the precision of someone still processing high-quality trauma. "You know that moment when you're calculating a project timeline and realize the deadline is physically impossible? Normally, you go to the meeting, present the numbers, and the deadline is adjusted. Here, Commander Osei sat down, looked at my calculations, and said, 'Those are the conservative mode restrictions. What's the timeline in the mode where we assume everything will work the first time?' I said that wasn't how engineering worked. She agreed, and then asked for the timeline anyway, and then assembled a team specifically to attack every potential point of failure before it occurred. It wasn't that everything worked the first time. It was that someone had planned for the failures far enough in advance that they didn't matter. The station was informally called the Forge. Officially, it was Technical Recovery and Analysis Facility 7 Alpha, but no one used that name because the Forge captured something true about the place and about what was happening in it. By the time the Convergence ship's hulk was inserted into the largest work docks ever built for that purpose, 417 human specialists were waiting to work on it. Propulsion engineers, materials specialists, control systems technicians, 2 neurologists who had been recruited for reasons that didn't become completely clear until the 3rd week, when Mikhail Petrov presented his proposal for the ship's control system. The proposal had been developed by Mikhail during the sleeping hours he had sacrificed during the towing journey, and it was, by any conventional engineering metric, profoundly unconventional. The Convergence ship's original control system utilized a centralized artificial intelligence to coordinate all combat functions. The AI received sensor data, processed it, and executed. It was fast, precise, and, as Mikhail had discovered by analyzing the battle logs still on the ship's damaged server, completely incapable of responding to situations for which it had not been explicitly trained. "The Nullorn surprised them," he explained in the presentation to the expanded team. "Not technologically, tactically. They didn't fight in any way the Convergence AI had modeled. And an AI that doesn't have a model for a situation has no response to it. It freezes, or executes the closest available protocol, which is inadequate. "And your proposal is to replace the AI with what, exactly?" asked Dr. Ellison, who had arrived at the station as a USA representative and had stayed because she had realized the most important things were happening here, not in the offices she had come from. With 12 human pilots connected in a neural network. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the typical silence of technical presentations. It was the silence of people processing something not on the list of possible options. "Neural interface," said the senior neurologist, Dr. Marcus Webb, with the voice of someone calculating implications in real time. "You're talking about shared consciousness link?" "Real-time tactical data link," Mikhail corrected. "Not consciousness. Perception. Each pilot has access to the ship's complete sensory map, the tactical model of the other 11 pilots, and the ability to execute maneuvers that would be impossible with a single decision point. The system doesn't think for them. It ensures all 12 are thinking about the same reality at the same time." "That's never been done," Webb said. "Not on a combat scale, no. But neural interface technology exists. We use it in high-precision collaborative surgeries, in construction coordination in high-hazard environments, in emergency response teams. What I am proposing is to scale and integrate something we already know works." Webb was quiet for a moment. Then, "I need full access to the alien sensor system specifications, and I'll need volunteers for protocol testing." "I already have a list," Lyra said, from where she was sitting at the back of the room. Everyone turned. "I'm first on the list myself," she added. While the neural interface team worked, the other reconstruction issues advanced with the specific speed of people operating at the limit of their capabilities because what they were doing mattered enough to justify that limit. The issue of propulsion limiters was solved by an engineer named Sofia Torres, who had arrived at the Forge with 10 years of experience in engine control systems and a working philosophy she described as finding the system's logic that the designers didn't document. In 8 days, she had completely mapped the propulsion core's control firmware and identified the exact points where the 67% limiters were implemented. In 3 more days, she had developed a replacement module that recalibrated the output parameters using the field geometry Mikhail had calculated. When she presented the result to Mikhail, he stared at the schematic for a long moment and then asked, "Did you test this in simulation?" 100 times, Torres said. "Result? 94, 3% capacity, 0, 2% variation between runs." She paused. "The cores complain a bit. There are vibration harmonics that need to be actively compensated." "Actively how?" "The control system needs to make micro-adjustments to the field every 0.4 seconds to maintain cohesion. A central AI could do that, our 12-pilot system." She hesitated. "It will do it faster," Mikhail said, "because 12 simultaneous processing points respond to variations before they become problems." Torres looked at him. "Have you slept in the last few days?" "Define slept." "More than 4 continuous hours." "Then no." "Mikhail, Sophia." He looked at her with the specific seriousness of someone who is completely aware of being irrational. "When this ship is working, I will sleep 12 hours straight, I promise. For now, I need you to show me the harmonic compensation." She sighed and showed him. The issue of the spine took longer. Elena Park had disassembled the Nullorn weapon component by component in a process she described for her personal logs as technical archaeology applied to an artifact that can destabilize matter if I approach it incorrectly. Analysis revealed a functioning mechanism that was simultaneously simple and profound. The weapon generated a molecular interference field tuned to the specific binding frequencies of the target materials. It didn't explode. It didn't cut. It created a temporary window of structural incoherence during which materials behaved as if their atomic bonds were suggestions, not laws. The problem was that the spine had been calibrated for specific convergence materials, which were the only materials the Nullorn had encountered in sufficient quantity to tune the weapon. Against human materials, it was possible it would be ineffective, or that it would require recalibration for each target, which made it impractical as a combat weapon. The solution came from a direction Elena had not anticipated: the incomplete integration data that the convergence ship had initiated before being deactivated. The ship was trying to learn the weapon, she explained to Lyra and Mikhail. One afternoon, when the three met in a station corridor because the meeting rooms were all occupied. The integration process wasn't just system connection. It was active analysis. The ship's AI was trying to map the spine's operating mechanism to be able to calibrate it for its own weapon systems. And the process was interrupted, Lyra said. Interrupted, but not erased. The partial analysis data is still on the server, and with what I've learned by manually disassembling the weapon, I can complete the mapping. Elena paused. I can make the spine work with any material for which I have a reference sample, including Nullorn materials, if we ever get a sample. Include material adaptation as a priority in the integration project, Lyra said. 3 months after the start of reconstruction, an external event altered the project's dynamic in a way no planning had anticipated. An official convergence representative arrived at the forge. His name, in the transliteration of his language, was Vethrak Som, and he belonged to one of the coalition's oldest species, the Velhari, who were humanoid only in the sense of having 2 arms and 2 legs, but who possessed an upright posture that made them almost 30 centimeters taller than the average human, and a skin coloration that subtly changed according to emotional state, which Lyra had learned to read within an hour of interaction. Vethrak Som arrived with the formal authority to demand the vessel's return. He brought comprehensive legal documentation and arguments that the USA lawyers took 2 days to analyze completely. Lyra received him personally, which was the correct protocol, and then invited him for a visit to the forge. He accepted. She had calculated that he would accept, because the Velhari had a natural curiosity for technical solutions that was difficult to suppress even when the political situation demanded distance. What Vethrak Som saw when he entered the station's main hangars made him stand still for 45 seconds without speaking, and his skin coloration went through 3 changes that Lyra didn't have enough references to translate precisely, but which seemed to operate on a spectrum between surprise and something more complex. The ship was being rebuilt, not repaired, rebuilt. Where there had been ceremonial space designed for rituals humans did not know, there were now ammunition bays and compact machinery compartments. Where there had been centralized and inert control systems, there was the construction architecture of a distributed neural network that would connect 12 human minds into something unprecedented. On the hull, in sections the engineers had had to replace, there were panels with alloys developed specifically for the forge, lighter than the original, and with energy dissipation properties Mikhail had discovered by accident during a material test. You destroyed the Sovereign, Vethrak Som said finally, and his voice had a quality the universal translator identified as high emotional processing state, which Lyra interpreted as well-contained shock. We reimagined it, Lyra said. These are not the original systems. This is not the original design. This is no longer the Sovereign. No, it is the Prometheus. He turned to look at her carefully. Why that name? In human mythology, Lyra said, Prometheus was a titan who brought fire from the gods to humans. The gods were furious, but the fire remained. Vethrak Som was quiet for a long moment. His skin took on a coloration the translator tried to identify and failed. Your legal claim is invalid, he said finally, not as a threat but as a statement of fact. Article 7 of the treaty is clear, but the Convergence will file a formal protest. I understand, Lyra said, and will require a review of salvage laws at the next council session. I also understand. He looked back at the ship under construction. Will it work? It was the first question that wasn't political or legal, and Lyra recognized in it the genuine curiosity she had expected. Yes, she said. How can you be sure? Because we're not finished yet, she said, and it already works better than anything we had before. Vethrak-Som departed 2 days later with the formal protest prepared and, Lyra observed, no particular hurry to issue it. Reconstruction continued, and at some point during the 5th month, when the neural interface systems were tested for the first time with the 12 pilots connected simultaneously and the collective sensation of 12 minds seeing the same space at the same time through the ship's sensors was described by all of them, independently, as being the ship, Lyra O.C. felt, for the first time since she had crossed the airlock that day at 0917, that what they were doing was possible. Not just technically possible. Possible in the sense that the pieces that needed to exist existed and were, against all odds and conventional institutional opinion, in the right place. The first time the 12 pilots simultaneously connected to the Prometheus's neural interface, 2 of them cried. It was not documented in the official report. Dr. Webb, who had overseen the process with the methodical precision of a scientist witnessing something his training had not adequately prepared him to describe, merely recorded varied emotional responses during initial synchronization protocol, which was the appropriate technical language for the phenomenon, but captured approximately 0% of its true nature. What happened was this. During the first 45 seconds of full synchronization, the 12 pilots simultaneously experienced the Prometheus's complete sensory field, not as data, as direct perception. Every external sensor on the ship, calibrated for frequencies ranging from radio waves to gamma rays, translated into something the neural system interpreted as a sense. The ship's internal structure became proprioception. The engines became something vaguely analogous to musculature. And outer space, with its radiation textures and gravity gradients and the constant background of cosmic microwave radiation, became environment. 2 of the pilots cried because the experience of simultaneously being a human mind and a 3-kilometer ship in space was, even after months of theoretical preparation and progressive protocol tests, an experience of scale that the limbic system had not been designed to process without emotional response. The other 10 remained very quiet for different reasons. The lead pilot was Lieutenant Commander Ifeoma Adeyemi, 36 years old, with 15 years of experience piloting salvage vessels in high-hazard zones and a reputation for making tactical decisions under pressure that her superiors described as disconcertingly good and that she herself described as paying attention to the right things. She had been chosen by Lyra not for being the best individual pilot, but for possessing the specific ability to coordinate collective action in real time, which was a different, and for the purposes of the neural interface, more relevant capability. When the synchronization protocol completed and the 12 pilots stabilized in shared perception, it was Ifeoma who spoke first. Through the neural channel, her voice reached the other 11 not just as audio, but as intention, which made communication within the system faster and less ambiguous than any verbal language could ever be. "Everyone present?" she said. 11 confirmations. Not words. Confirmations. "Good. Let's make the Prometheus move." What occurred in the following 40 minutes was extensively documented by Webb and his team, but the essential quality of the experience resisted any adequate documentation. The ship moved. Not the way an AI-controlled ship moves, following calculated parameters and executing optimized trajectories. The Prometheus moved the way an organism moves, with the fluidity of something making distributed decisions in real time, adjusting and readjusting, feeling the forces acting upon it, and responding before any formal calculation could be completed. The harmonic compensation systems Torres had developed for the engines at 94% worked because the pilots, through the interface, felt the variations before the instruments registered them, and made the necessary micro-adjustments with an anticipation that was, technically, impossible. Or would be impossible if the direct sensory perception of the engines didn't make the harmonics something closer to sounds than to data. And humans had been avoiding wrong notes long before there were instruments to measure them. Mikhail stood in the station's control room observing the real-time data with the expression of a man who calculated something would work and is genuinely surprised that it is working. Current speed, 94. 1% of theoretical capacity, the monitoring system announced, with that computer neutrality that lacks the ability to appreciate the improbability of what it is reporting. Vibration harmonics within safe operating parameters, Torres added beside Mikhail, with a voice of absolute containment that he had learned to recognize as her expression of intense joy. 90-degree rotation maneuver in 3 seconds, Ifeoma announced over the external communications channel. No 3-kilometer ship had ever performed a 90-degree rotation in 3 seconds. It was against the physics of rotational inertia for objects of that mass. The Prometheus performed the rotation in 2 seconds and 83 hundredths. How? Torres asked, genuinely to the data. They anticipated, Mikhail said. They started compensating for rotational inertia before initiating the movement. The original AI waited for the movement to begin to calculate compensation. The pilots initiated compensation while they were still deciding to make the movement. Torres was quiet for a moment. The ship thinks before it acts? No. 12 humans think before they act, and the ship executes what they've already decided while they're still finalizing the decision. Mikhail looked at her. Can you model that phenomenon? Not accurately. Me neither. He returned to the data with the expression of someone happy with a problem he can't solve. We'll keep observing. Over the next 2 months, flight tests advanced systematically. The team of pilots, who had begun to refer to themselves collectively as the Neural Crew, developed tactical protocols that did not exist in any combat manual of any species, precisely because there had never been a control system that made such protocols possible. Elena Park, who had spent this final period finalizing the integration of the spine into the Prometheus's weapon system, presented the results of the armament tests at a meeting Lyra convened in the 7th month of the project. The spine is integrated and operational, Elena announced. Material calibration works as designed. I tested it against samples of all documented Null-Orn vessel materials that the Convergence had shared with us after the Minor Kareth incident. Results? Lyra asked. Efficacy of 89% to 97%, depending on the specific target composition. The molecular interference harmonics penetrate conventional force fields because they do not interact with the fields as matter or directional energy. They interact with the materials through the fields. Elena paused. Armor that the force field is designed to protect remains vulnerable to the spine because the armor is not designed to defend itself from itself. There were 8 people in the room. All were quiet long enough for the meaning to fully sink in. You're saying the spine ignores shields, Dr. Ellison said. Technically, the shields don't even perceive the spine passing through them, Elena said. It's like trying to stop smoke with a sieve. The field was built to block things the sieve can hold. Lyra looked at Elena for a moment. And convergence materials? Does the weapon still affect them? I tested samples Vethraxom left with us. Elena hesitated. Yes, but I didn't activate the result for him. Correct. Lyra looked at the ceiling for a second, processing. We don't need that information circulating yet. The news that changed the project timeline came in the 8th month, in a maximum priority coded message from the Unified Space Authority that Lyra received at 0209 and read alone before convening any meeting. The Null-Orn had advanced into the Deep Kareth system. Deep Kareth was a system with 3 colonized worlds. With a combined population of approximately 4 million inhabitants distributed between convergence colonies and a joint research station where two coalition species had worked for decades on a stellar mapping project. A convergence combat fleet had been positioned there 2 months prior, after Nulorn advance patterns were projected by analysts who, for the first time in 200 years of records, had managed to identify a logical progression in enemy movement. The fleet consisted of 43 vessels. The largest of them, the Convergence flagship, was 1/3 smaller than the Prometheus. The USA message stated that, according to diplomatic sources, the Convergence had requested reinforcements from all allied species. There was an implicit number in the message that Lyra read between the lines, with the clarity of someone who knows the language of requests that are not officially requests. The Convergence needed help it didn't yet know how to ask for. She sat in the dark of her cabin for 20 minutes, rereading the message and looking at the Prometheus's performance data that was always open on her secondary screen. Then she went to the operations room, where the early morning shift was quiet, and requested a secure channel with Director Ashworth's office. "When can the Prometheus be considered operationally ready?" she asked. When he answered with the expression of someone who was also awake and expecting this call, Ashworth was quiet for a moment. "Certification tests still need 6 weeks. If we reduce the test to an emergency protocol with the data we already have, 2, maybe 3. He looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Lyra said carefully, "that deep vacuum salvage laws exist because humanity learned that abandoning things is a waste, and that this principle applies to ships, to technology, and sometimes, also, to situations." Ashworth was quiet for longer now. "The Convergence hasn't asked for help. I know. Going to Deep Careth uninvited would be a political statement of considerable proportions. I also know." Lyra looked at him. "But it's the right thing to do, and we both know that." He was quiet for 30 seconds. Then, "I'll approve the emergency certification protocol. I want a full readiness report in 48 hours. The team meeting took place in the morning, after Lyra had slept 3 hours and prepared the briefing with the precision the situation demanded. She didn't romanticize. She didn't appeal to heroism. She presented the facts, the calculated risks, and the ship's current capability assessment. "Probability of combat success against the documented Nulorn formation in Deep Careth with the tactical data we have?" she asked. Mikhail and Elena exchanged glances. It was Elena who answered, "With the spine operational and the neural crew in control, incalculable. Not because it's low, because there's no precedent on which to base the calculation." "Incalculable is good enough," Lyra said. "Preparation for departure in 72 hours. Anyone with doubts about participating can approach me privately and will be transported to the station. No judgment, no service record." No one approached her. 72 hours later, the Prometheus left the forge under its own engines for the first time at 94. 3% capacity, and the entire station stopped to watch. 2,300 people who had built the impossible in 92 days stood in the corridors and observation windows and still open hangars, and no one said anything for a long moment as the ship moved away. Then someone started clapping, and in 10 seconds, the entire station was doing it, and Lyra, in the Prometheus's command center, heard through the external communications channel the sound of humans applauding a ship that was, at once, the most alien and the most human thing any of them had ever seen, and allowed herself, for exactly 4 seconds, to feel the full weight of what had been done. Then she looked forward. There was work to do. The Deep Careth system was beautiful, in the specific way star systems can be beautiful when you're observing them from afar and have no knowledge of the 43 warships positioned between you and them. The Prometheus emerged from hyperspace too. 3 astronomical units from the outermost planet. in the position Ipheoma's tactical analysts had determined as the entry angle with the widest field of view and least immediate exposure. The hyperspace exit protocol normally generated a long-range, detectable energy signature, which made tactical surprise virtually impossible for conventional ships. The Prometheus had solved this problem with a solution Mikhail had described for the engineering logs as exit energy containment geometry, and which in practical language meant that the ship used the propulsion core's own fields to absorb and redistribute the hyperspace emergence energy, reducing the detectable signature to approximately 12% of normal. In even more practical language, they arrived without most sensors knowing they had arrived. The scene that the Prometheus's sensors captured and that reached the consciousness of the 12 pilots simultaneously was as follows. The Convergence fleet was in defensive formation around the second planet, 43 ships arranged in concentric layers that were, tactically, the correct response to the combat doctrine the Convergence had developed over centuries. It was elegant, coordinated, and completely inadequate for what was coming their way. The Nullorn advanced in a formation that did not correspond to any pattern recorded in the Convergence battle archives. It wasn't a formation. It was closer to a field, a set of vessels moving with a coherence that suggested instantaneous communication between elements, without visible hierarchy, without identifiable flagship, without a focal point for a decapitation strike. 27 Nullorn vessels, each approximately 2 kilometers long, advancing at speeds the Convergence had clearly not anticipated. "They are tuning primary weapons," Pilot Rao said, through the neural channel, where words arrived accompanied by direct perception of the data she was processing. "Their formation is calibrated to saturate the outer layers of Convergence defense before the inner ships can reposition." "How long until contact?" Ipheoma asked. 6 minutes, said Pilot Chen, who was monitoring approach speeds. "The Convergence will lose the 2 outer layers in the first 2 minutes. After that, the defensive structure collapses." "Mikhail," Lyra said from the command center where she observed the data alongside the engineering team. "Cores, status, 94, 2%. Torres is keeping an eye on the harmonics. We have margin for what we need." Lyra looked at the Nullorn formation through the ship's sensors, and there was a quality to the shared perception that was different from looking at a tactical map on a screen. It was more immediate, more real. The distance between the Prometheus and the 27 enemy vessels was measurable not just as numbers, but as space the ship felt around it, with all its gravitational and radiation textures. "Ipheoma," Lyra said, "what do you need?" 4 minutes to reach optimal engagement position. 2 for the first spine cycle. After that, it's tactical." The lead pilot paused. "They haven't seen us yet." "Correct. But they will when we move." "Correct. Then we have to make those 4 minutes count for the element of surprise we're going to lose." There was a quality in Ipheoma's voice. Even through the neural channel where emotional nuances arrived more directly than in any spoken language, that was not fear. It was crystallized focus, the specific mental state some people achieve when the complexity of a situation is high enough that the brain shuts down everything non-essential and operates with a clarity not available under normal conditions. "Move," Ipheoma said. The Prometheus moved, not like a 3-kilometer ship moves, like something that had decided to move and whose body simply executed that decision before physics had time to complain. What happened in the following minutes was recorded by multiple Convergence sensor systems, and the analysts who later studied the recordings produced reports that diverged significantly in their tactical interpretations, but converged on one point. None of them had a model for what they saw. The Prometheus did not attack the Nullorn formation. It entered it. The idea, which had emerged from the 60 days of tactical protocol development the neural crew had carried out during flight tests, was based on an observation Pilot Nkosi had made during a simulation, that the Nullorn's field formation was effective against external attacks precisely because all elements supported each other. but that this same interdependence created internal blind spots, angles where the mutual support of external elements blocked the firing arc of internal elements. In simple language, the formation was a shield that was also a trap, but only if someone was inside to exploit the blind spots. The Prometheus at 94. 2% capacity and with 12 pilots who experienced space as direct perception, was maneuverable enough to do what no vessel of that mass had done before. Penetrate an enemy combat formation at speed, using the formation's own tactical gaps to navigate. The Nullorn detected it 73 seconds after the movement began. The response was immediate. 17 of the 27 vessels redirected towards the Prometheus. But redirecting meant changing trajectories that had been calculated for the original formation, and changing trajectories has inertia, and inertia takes time. "Spine warming up," Elena said from the armament station. "Nullorn material calibration confirmed. Ready in 90 seconds. Firing position in 72, Ifeoma said. The 8-second difference was not a problem. The Neural crew had developed a protocol for synchronization intervals during high-speed maneuvers that used the ship's own movements as a firing position adjustment. The Prometheus, instead of slowing down to the optimal position, would use the acceleration trajectory to create the correct angle during the movement. It was the kind of maneuver that did not exist in any manual because no previous control system had been capable of executing it with the necessary precision. The spine fired. The molecular interference field expanded from a point in space and reached 3 Nullorn vessels simultaneously because the firing angle had been calculated to maximize the area of effect using the target's relative positions. There was no explosion. There was no dramatic light. There were only 3 Nullorn vessels that, for 3 seconds, experienced a condition where the materials composing them forgot their structural properties. The Prometheus's kinetic weapons, which had been prepared in the preceding 30 seconds, passed through the 3 vessels in that 3-second interval in the way Mikhail had described as passing through air. The Convergence, which had been watching the scene with the specific disbelief of a military force observing tactics that had no category in its classification system, was the first to react in a coordinated manner. The Convergence flagship repositioned to support the Prometheus, understanding instinctively, if not completely, what the ship was doing. This was a miscalculation by Lyra, and she recognized it immediately when the data arrived. "They're moving to support," Pilot Kim said urgently. "But the repositioning is creating a gap in the second planet's defensive layer." "The Nullorn will see the gap," Rao said. "They already have," Chen said. 4 Nullorn vessels turned to exploit the gap at the exact moment it opened. Lyra had time to think exactly one thing: that the Nullorn's field formation was not just defense and attack. It was active adaptation. They were learning in real time. "Ifeoma," she said. "Already saw it," the lead pilot said. What the Neural crew did in the following 48 seconds was not adequately documented by any recording system, not because the systems failed, but because what happened was simultaneously simple and impossible to describe sequentially. 12 human minds, sharing a perception of space and situation, made hundreds of interdependent micro-decisions that resulted in an interception trajectory that had not been planned, calculated, or predicted by any tactical model. It emerged. The Prometheus intercepted the 4 Nullorn vessels, 3 astronomical units from the second planet. The spine fired twice. The kinetic weapons did the rest. It had been 11 minutes since entering the system. The remaining Nullorn vessels stopped. Not in the way fleets stop when evaluating a situation. They stopped in the way forces stop when they encounter a variable they cannot calculate. And the inability to calculate produces, even in non-human intelligence systems, something functionally equivalent to hesitation. 20 Nullorn vessels in deep Kareth space, 7 destroyed in 11 minutes. A 3-kilometer ship that had penetrated their formation, used blind spots they didn't know they had, and fired a weapon that had originally been theirs, an uncatalogued variable. "They're retreating," Pilot Mwangi said, with a specific quality in her voice that the neural channel amplified to all 12 simultaneously. Not triumph, but something closer to genuine awe. "Confirm," Chen said. "All Nulorn units on exit vector. Retreat speed increasing." In the Convergence flagship's communications room, Admiral Vera Tash, who had commanded fleets for 70 years of service and who had, in the last 40 minutes, come to the conclusion that Deep Kareth would be the system where his career and possibly his species would face definitive defeat, stared at the data long enough for his crew to begin to wonder if there was something wrong with him beyond the evident shock. Then he opened a channel to the Prometheus. "Human vessel," he said, and the translation captured the texture of his voice with enough precision to convey that a very old and very experienced being was choosing words carefully. "Identification and authorization, please." Lyra answered the channel personally. "ECV Prometheus, Commander Lyra Osei, Unified Space Authority Authorization, Emergency Assistance Protocol, 7 Gamma. A pause. "You were not invited, Commander Osei." "No," she agreed. Another pause. "The Nullorn have never retreated." "I know." The next pause was longer. "What did you use against them? That weapon? It's not human technology." "Not exactly," Lyra said. "It's technology we found in a place where it had been abandoned. We believe abandoned objects deserve a second chance to be useful." The pause this time lasted long enough for Mikhail at the engineering station to look at Lyra with an expression that was half question mark and half admiration for the precision of the answer. "We need to talk," Admiral Vera Tash said finally. "I agree completely," Lyra said. "But first, you're wounded. You lost 5 ships in the outer layers before we arrived. Do your medical systems need support?" The question made the Admiral quiet in a different way than before. "You are offering medical assistance," he said. It was not a question. "We are a salvage vessel, Admiral, before anything else." There was no immediate response on the channel, but the Prometheus's sensor data showed that the Convergence flagship had shifted its angle, very slightly, from a technically neutral posture to a technically receptive one. These were details of nonverbal communication that the neural crew collectively captured and that reached all 12 as a subtle change in environmental temperature, an inadequate metaphor, but the closest human language could get. "Yes," the Admiral said finally, "medical assistance would be welcome." The Prometheus began to move towards the Convergence flagship, slowly and with transparency of intent, and the Deep Kareth system, which had been 12 minutes away from becoming another record of loss in the Coalition's archives, began to calm down in the particular way places calm after the crisis has passed and the work that comes next begins. There were wounded to attend to, systems to evaluate, and a very important conversation waiting on the other side of an open channel with an admiral who had, in the last 11 minutes, seen everything he believed to know about military power and species, limits irreversibly called into question. Lyra was prepared for that conversation. She had been preparing for it since the moment she had crossed the airlock of an abandoned ship in empty space and decided there was something there that deserved to be saved. The Convergence Council had been convened 64 times in its 400-year history. 63 of those sessions had occurred under circumstances that the participating species considered extraordinary. The 64th occurred because a human commander of a salvage ship had appeared in a battle to which she had not been invited, defeated a threat the Coalition had not been able to contain, and then remained in Deep Kareth space for 18 hours assisting Convergence medical teams in treating the wounded from the 5 lost vessels in the defensive layers, using life support equipment that was technically incompatible with the biochemistry of 3 of the 6 species involved, but which engineer Sofia Torres had adapted during the journey with the same pragmatism she had applied to all the project's other impossible problems. Mikhail had documented this adaptation in the engineering log with the note, "Field improvisation. Efficacy confirmed. Document protocol for future use." It was the kind of note that captured technical information without capturing the context of Torres working continuously for 14 hours with life support materials not designed to work together, guided by a convergence biologist who communicated specifications through the universal translator and who then, when the system worked, remained silent long enough for Torres to ask if something was wrong. The biologist had replied, no. That she was just processing the fact that Torres had solved a biochemical compatibility problem that convergence medical engineers had listed as non-urgent 20 years prior because the solution required resources that other priorities always superseded. Torres had said that sometimes it helped not to know what was impossible. This episode had come to the attention of Admiral Vera Tash, who had mentioned it in his formal communication with the Council in a way that, according to Dr. Ellison, who had followed the entire subsequent diplomatic process with the attention of someone who knows she is witnessing history, had changed the tone of the entire subsequent discussion even before it officially began. The Council session took place on an orbital station located at a gravitational equilibrium point between two convergence systems, a place chosen precisely because it did not belong to any specific member. It was a space of neutrality that the 6 species had built specifically for conversations that needed to occur outside the territory of any of them. Lyra went alone. She had considered bringing Mikhail or Ellison for support, and had decided that going alone was the correct statement. Not arrogance, calculated confidence. The council chamber was designed for 6 species with different anatomies, which resulted in a space that was simultaneously impressive and slightly uncomfortable for any of the occupants, which was perhaps intentional. The human chairs had been provided sufficiently in advance so that Lyra did not have to stand, which was, in itself, a communication. They expected her. They had prepared for her. There were 6 titular council representatives, 1 per species, and a number of advisors Lyra chose not to count for focus reasons. Vethrak Som was present in the role of Velhari representative, which had been, according to Ellison, a deliberate choice by the Velhari, given that he was the only high-level convergence member who had visited the Forge personally. The titular representative of the Coalition's oldest species, a being named Saelvrith, who belonged to a civilization with historical records of approximately 1,200 years, was the first to speak. "Commander Osei," she said, with the precision of someone who chooses words like tools. "You intervened in Deep Kareth without solicitation, without formal authorization from this coalition, and in violation of established diplomatic protocol." "That is correct," Lyra said. "You also saved a system with 4 million inhabitants and defeated a force we had not been able to contain in 200 years of attempts." "That is also correct." "Therefore," Saelvrith continued with the impassivity of someone presenting data, "we need to discuss what to do with you." "I prefer to discuss what to do with the Nullorn," Lyra said. They retreated, but they were not defeated. 20 undestroyed vessels returned to wherever they came from, with new information about our capabilities. The window of tactical advantage we have is limited. There was something in the way she said our capabilities that Ellison, monitoring via observation channel, later described as the moment she realized the meeting had changed character without anyone formally announcing the change. Saelvrith observed Lyra for a moment. "You are suggesting coordinated action." "I am suggesting that the situation demands coordinated action, and that humanity has a specific contribution to offer in that coordination." Lyra paused. "The Prometheus works. The neural interface technology is documentable and transferable. The spine's integration can be replicated on other platforms with adequate time and resources. And if the Coalition provides samples of Nullorn material collected in previous battles, we can calibrate the spine for maximum efficacy. You are asking for access to classified military files. said the representative of another species, a being named Thresh Ono, with a voice modulated by translators to a lower register than was probably original. "I am offering a partnership," Lyra said, "on equal terms." The silence that followed was of a particular quality. It was the silence of ancient organizations processing a proposal not on their list of known options. Vethrak Som spoke for the first time. "When I was at your forge facility, you told me the name Prometheus comes from a mythological being who brought fire from the gods to humans. Yes, the gods were furious. In the story, yes. And the fire remained," he said, and there was something in his voice that the translator identified as pattern recognition with unstated implication. "Yes," Lyra said, "the fire remained." Another silence. Then Saelvrith spoke again. "There is a position on the council that is not a titular member. It is a strategic partner position with access to relevant sessions and advisory vote on security matters. It has never been filled because there has never been a species that met the criteria." A pause. "Humanity meets the criteria." Lyra looked at her. "What are the criteria?" "Verified technological capability, demonstration of effective military action, and," Saelvrith paused in a way that seemed deliberate, "a history of prioritizing the survival of others over self-risk." The last criterion hung in the air for a moment. "The offer of medical assistance," Lyra said, understanding. "Among other records." Torres's medical team, who worked 14 hours with incompatible biochemistry. The decision not to claim credit for the adapted Nullorn weapon before ensuring the Convergence wounded were stabilized. Saelvrith tilted her head slightly. "We document everything, Commander." "I know you document," Lyra said. "Then you know our analysis was comprehensive." "Yes. And yet you came alone." "Calibrated confidence," Lyra said, "not arrogance." Something the translator identified as approval passed through the group, subtle enough to be easily missed, and Lyra chose not to miss it. "The strategic partner position," she said, "requires what exactly?" The negotiation took 2 days. Lyra had brought only one change of clothes and had slept 5 hours a night, which was sufficient for her particular tolerance for sleep deprivation, which had been sufficiently tested throughout her career to be known with precision. Ellison had sent legal consultants via secure channel, but the substance of the negotiations had remained with Lyra because there were parts of the process that were about intention as much as about text, and intention is difficult to delegate. The final agreement included strategic partnership with advisory vote, access to military files relevant to the anti-Nullorn effort, a review of deep vacuum salvage laws to include a technological partnership framework that replaced the dispute over the Prometheus with a cooperative protocol, and, in a clause personally proposed by Vethrak Som, an engineer exchange program where human specialists and convergent specialists would work together on technological adaptation projects. Lyra had accepted all clauses and had added one of her own, that the exchange program explicitly include training in methodologies for adapting incompatible systems, not just what to adapt, but how to think about adapting. Vethrak Som had read the additional clause and been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, with a quality of voice the translator had not been able to adequately categorize, "You want to teach us how to jury-rig." "I want to teach how to find solutions in the spaces between existing systems," Lyra said. "The name you use for that is a matter of perspective." He had approved the clause. On the journey back, with the Prometheus cruising at 60% speed, while the neural crew rested in shifts, Lyra sat in the command center with a mug of coffee and the performance data that was now her standard reading material for quiet moments, and thought about the path from that alarm at 03:17 to this moment. Mikhail had finally slept his promised 12 hours, and woken with his hair slightly less chaotic, and the expression of someone who had processed, during sleep, a considerable number of unresolved problems. He had arrived at the command center with his own coffee and sat in silence for a while before speaking. "The exchange program," he said. "Who are you thinking of sending first?"
"Torres,"
Lyra said.
"She's already proven she can work with incompatible systems under pressure, and she'll enjoy it."
"And on their side?"
"Vethrak-Som will name someone. Probably someone who has already demonstrated curiosity for unconventional methodologies."
Mikhail was quiet for a moment. "Do you know what this means? In the long term?"
"Yes.
Not just the partnership, the exchange. We teach how to think differently about problems. They teach what they know. In 50 years, neither methodology will be recognizable as original."
"That's the goal," Lyra said.
"You planned this from the beginning." She looked at him. "I planned that it was the correct outcome if things worked. Planning the correct outcome is not the same as ensuring it occurs. But you knew it would work."
"I knew there was a reasonable chance. In salvage, reasonable is enough to try."
Mikhail was quiet for longer now, looking at the propulsion data with the expression of someone thinking about something not related to engines. "The Nulorn will return," he said finally. "Yes, and they will be different, adapted to what they saw." "Yes, and we'll need to be different too." "Also yes." Lyra took a sip of coffee. "That's why the exchange is more important than the victory in Deep Kareth. The battle was a data point. What we do with the data point is what determines the next points."
Mikhail nodded slowly. "There's no definitive victory."
"No, there's only the next job." He was silent for a moment, then, "Do you think they'll include this in the historical archives? What really happened?" Lyra thought of the record Vethrak-Som had mentioned in one of the last negotiation sessions, almost as an aside, that the Convergence Historical Archives had included a new annotation alongside the old record of human salvage rights. He hadn't quoted the exact text, but he had said the substance was a recommendation for younger civilizations about what happened when broken objects were left where humans could find them. She had asked what the recommendation said. He had been quiet for a moment, and then had said, with that vocal quality the translator identified as something between irony and affection, "That we not do that." Lyra smiled now, remembering. "They will include it," she said to Mikhail, "from their point of view." "And from our point of view?" She looked out the observation window, where space passed at 60% cruising speed, a vastness of cosmic debris and traces of civilizations and points of light that were entire systems with histories humanity was still learning to read. "From our point of view," she said, "we found a broken ship. We fixed it. And in the process, we discovered some things we needed to know. About the Nulorn, about the Convergence, about ourselves." She looked at him. "That we are at our best when we work at the limit of what we know. That impossible problems are the ones worth the sleep deprivation. That the most human thing that exists is perhaps the refusal to accept that something is finished just because someone decided it was." Mikhail was quiet for a long while. Then he raised his mug in a gesture that was half toast and half acknowledgement. "To the next broken ship," he said. "To the next broken ship," Lyra agreed. The Prometheus continued its journey back. 3 kilometers of dark metal and neural interface, and a weapon that had been an enemy projectile, and was now part of something that had not existed before, patrolling the darkness between the stars with the specific conviction of creatures who had learned, throughout their history, that the end of things is rarely definitive when there is someone willing to do the work of starting over. At some point in the Convergence archives, a new record was added alongside an old military disposal protocol. The translation into English would be approximate, because the original language had developed nuances for situations that had not existed before. Recommendation for future use: do not leave broken objects where humans can find them. They do not accept the end of things, and what they build with the fragments tends to be more dangerous, more useful, and more enduring than the original. Alongside the recommendation, in the additional observations field, someone, possibly Vethrak Som, had added a note that was not in the standard archive format and had passed through formatting filters, probably because no moderation system had anticipated that someone would need a category for it. Or, alternatively, cultivate the friendship of those who fix things. The universe has many broken objects, and they never stop. End of story. If the tenacity of the human crew inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more chronicles from the galactic frontier. New stories arrive every week, bringing civilizations, paradoxes, and the perennial question of why humanity somehow always finds a way. Activate the bell to not miss the next chapter of the saga.